Good afternoon, everyone. I am Amy Dickerson.
Sorry, finding my mute. I'm Kendra Yak.
And welcome to the third webinar in our Forensic Educational Equity series. Kendra and I will be your moderators for this monthly series that will run throughout the year. And during the series, we're exploring how school districts can identify and break down systemic barriers that are depriving our Black and Brown students of equitable educational opportunities, how to more intentionally allocate resources based on need, and how to use the law as a driver for internal reforms to support our most vulnerable student populations. As we've said in previous webinars, these conversations may not always be comfortable, but they are critical to helping make meaningful and positive changes in our public school systems. Today, we will be discussing recruiting, hiring, and retaining a diverse group of teachers and administrators. And we are very pleased to have with us our colleague, Jason Patterson, as well as Toya Campbell, Chief Human Resources Officer at Evanston High School District 202, and Ken Kleber, Assistant Superintendent of Human Resources and Organizational Effectiveness at Champaign Unit School District 4. Welcome to you both. And we also are very happy to have with us Jennifer Kirmes from the Illinois State Board of Education to speak about Illinois' new culturally responsive teaching and leading standards. So before we begin, we want to address some general logistics. Please submit your questions through the Q&A function on Zoom. It is much easier for us to keep track of and answer questions there than in the chat. And if you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to contact any of us. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. First, to get some background, let's begin with Ms. Campbell and Mr. Kleber. If you can briefly tell us about the districts that you currently serve and why the issues of equity and diversity are important to you in your HR role. So Ms. Campbell, can we start with you?
Surely. Good afternoon. Thank you for having me. Our district serves approximately 4,000 students who speak approximately 67 different languages, and we have 635 staff members. Almost 52% of our staff are non-white, and our mission is embracing its diversity. ETHS dedicates itself to educating all students to their fullest potential. So as the Chief Human Resource Officer, we look for candidates who recognize that racism is the most devastating factor, contributing to diminished achievements of students. We also look for candidates who strive to eliminate the predictability of academic achievement based on race. And we actively continue to examine and eliminate institutional beliefs, policies, and practices in teaching that perpetuate racial disparities in achievement. So it's important because we believe that our staff should be reflective of our student population. We know that it helps students be more engaged, and we also know that it assists in breaking down those barriers of academic achievement.
Thank you. Mr. Kleber?
Good afternoon. So our district is a pre-K-12 district. We have 19 campuses that serve about 10,000 students, just over 10,000, from very diverse backgrounds. So race, ethnicity, home language, IEP 504 status, socioeconomic status, gender. Unlike many communities in Illinois, Champaign is actually growing. We don't contract out our services, so transportation, custodial, food service, subs. So we have a very large workforce, 2,000 employees serving our students in all different settings. About a third of our staff overall is non-white. 18% of our licensed staff are non-white. Recently, our Board of Education passed a resolution declaring racism a public health crisis. And we also adopted a new strategic plan that's focused on equity, owning the challenges we have, improving outcomes for our underserved students. Our mission is to positively transform learning and life outcomes for students through educational justice, equity, and excellence. As Assistant Superintendent of HR, having these clearly defined core values, which are focused on equity, allows my team and me to reach like-minded educators who are interested in joining us.
Thank you both. It's great to have administrators from different parts of the state and different size districts, but clearly a really similar focus on how you approach this. So I'm wondering if we can jump right into kind of what are your top strategies or initiatives that you're using to attract and retain candidates from different backgrounds. And maybe we can sort of alternate so you go back and forth and we can share kind of one at a time. Toya, do you want to start us off?
Sure. What's really important is to make sure that your environment is ready to receive the candidates that you are recruiting. If the environment is not welcoming, inclusive, and open, people of color may be recruited all day long, but they will not stay. And this is really something that I want people to wrap their heads around and embrace. You can't just recruit and then say, my job is done, because it's not. You still have to retain them. And they still have to be happy in the spaces where they are so that they are able to give you their best when they're teaching. We offer spaces for our employees of color, like affinity groups. We have something called Equity Recess, where people can come and have conversation about what's going on for them that day. There could be something that was happening that day that, hit on something that they need to discuss. We have one full day of onboarding and an introduction to our entire community on our first Institute Day. So that integrates people into our community, into our family. We have a 3-year induction and mentoring program called Evanston Educator Academy, or EEA. It's designed to introduce all of our new licensed staff to the culture of our building and its commitment to equity and excellence. We don't assume that people know that walking in the door. It is discussed heavily during the interview process, but we do have a process that integrates people so they are clear about what our expectations are. They engage in a variety of professional learning opportunities, and they design culturally relevant lessons that are facilitated by our staff that we've trained, and we've had them, so we now have trained the trainer. And that's been very helpful. All of our staff, when they're hired, go through Beyond Diversity training. We have a connections conference that's held annually where employees actually do professional development for each other. And we have employee recognition programs and fun events that are designed to connect all staff so that everybody is feeling like they are part of the building. So that's the first one.
Great. Ken, you want to share one as well? That
Yeah,
one
so
was kind of a big overarching one, and I appreciate that.
Yeah, and I'll talk a little bit about some of that in my next one, but I think I'll start with recruiting, right? So I focused a little bit about some of the framework of our strategic plan. But as many people on this call probably understand, the candidate pipeline, especially in Illinois, is nowhere near what it was. It's nowhere near as robust it was even a few years ago. The pool in general is just much shallower. And strong candidates are really heavily courted. And so when we find strong candidates, especially candidates of color and those who have licensure in some of the hard to fill areas, we've really tried to take an individual approach in terms of recruiting them and helping them see the values of our district. As Toya mentioned, people want to feel that connection, right? So one of the things that we've done is we've worked with our union to create what we call on-the-spot offers, where we hire people basically outside of our normal hiring process. And so we invite them to visit the district, take tours of our buildings, meet some of our administrators, meet colleagues they would be working with, right? Often interacting and networking with people you're going to be working with who can answer some of the questions you have, right? Especially, if I'm a candidate of color and I'm able to ask questions of somebody who looks like me, right? What's in town for me? Those kinds of things. That's a really valuable thing for people. And so we've tried to use that as one of our strategies for getting people to see that, Champaign may be downstate, but we are a vibrant community. There are things here, and hopefully get people to come here.
I love that. It feels a little bit like recruiting a college athlete, come see what our place is like, feel like you can be part of it. That's really great. Toya, do you have another one?
Sure. We've been doing work on inclusion and diversity for about 12 to 13 years now in the district. And so we have built a reputation of inclusion. I am very fortunate to not have to hard recruit because we do have that reputation of inclusion. Our employees of color feel supported, and so they tell others about their personal experiences working in our district. So when I talk about making the environment inclusive and welcoming, it's really important because our employees have become our walking billboards. We typically don't have to recruit licensed staff. You know, people talk to other people and those connections happen. They happen in, you know, a variety of organizations or just through their personal connections. And so we're very fortunate to have that. And so that's why I say you go back to building your environment and making your environment strong so that you don't have to really work hard on the recruitment effort. It's really, we work harder on retaining than recruiting. We are having some difficulty recruiting paraprofessionals in special education right now because that job has just become really, really hard. And so we did implement an employee referral program. And so, you know, we talk to people about, you know, we want people who are like you. When you're a great employee, we want more great employees. And that has actually worked out. And they're actually using that program. And again, I think that's because they feel welcome in the environment to tell others.
Great. And I like that, really expanding from, you know, it's not just I want to go get these people. It's so much bigger, and what happens when you get there. Ken, you have another?
Yeah, so I think, you know, Toya said it a few times, and I think it's so important. It's really critical that candidates and then your employees, right, feel a connection with the district. And really more so than us in the HR office, quite honestly, the people they're going to be working with in the schools, right, and in other aspects of the community, right? It's not necessarily an HR thing to make people feel welcome every day and have that connection with their colleagues, because we just can't be there. We can do things. So for example, through our recruiting process, we're very thoughtful about the places we recruit. Are they going to have the diversity of candidates that we're seeking? Who's involved in the recruiting, right? Again, the importance of having people who look like the candidates we're trying to attract and who can interact with them in a way that's going to answer the questions and meet their needs. As part of the strategic planning work, we have started an affinity group for our leaders of color, and we have plans to add some more of those groups. Prior to COVID, it's a little hard now, but we had social events where educators of color can network with each other from across the district. We also invited all of our administrators, our members of the Board of Education, and in a very sort of informal way, allowed people just to build some connections and so not feel like they're isolated. One of our biggest things was we had an annual, again, pre-COVID, we had an annual in-house professional development conference with nationally known speakers. And we focused on topics important for our equity work and celebrating our diverse community. And we had, you know, hundreds of people who would come to those events, both our employees of color and our white employees who wanted to be an ally in some of this work. And so I think the importance of having not only networking opportunities for employees of color, but white allies who can let them know that, you know, they're supportive of these initiatives is so important.
Awesome. And I'll kind of bring in a question we just got in the Q&A asking for a little bit more specificity on sort of what type of conditions do you want to have in place to help promote retention? And how do you work with school administrators? And what role do administrators of color play in trying to retain? And so if you guys can kind of work those into your next, or add it into what you're going to talk about next, that would be awesome.
I think that kind of plays right into where what we do. One of our key strategies for retention is to just be genuine. People just want you to be genuine. They want to know that you're actually feeling it and you're actually telling the truth and you actually have their best interests at heart. So staff of color, faculty of color, they want to be treated well, no different than anyone else, fairly compensated, developed, listened to, included and respected. And they want to know that their contributions are equally assessed, equally valued, and implemented. Not because they're people of color. And I think that's really important. It's not just because they're people of color, but because they're qualified, and because they have earned it. And when you are not genuine in this process, people know it and it never works. And so I think if you are just, and I would say this to districts, if you are putting people in charge of this process who do not fully believe it, you should change them. Because if you are not genuine in what you are doing, it will not work. You will be frustrated and you will stop trying. And it is important to not stop trying.
Thanks. Yeah. Ken, you want to comment on that or share your next one?
So yeah, I would echo a lot of that, and I think I would say not only the people who are leading the work again from the central office level, but the leaders in the buildings, right? You know, where people devote their time and energy shows you where their values are, right? And so making sure that you have building leaders in place who are taking the time to get to know their staff and who are taking the time to be supportive and encouraging, and build that kind of community that they're going to tell their friends about, right? And that they're going to want to be those walking billboards, as Toya said. I think that's really important. We have some administrators who are really good at that, right? We have some areas where we need to grow in that too. And so the role we play in the central office is having those critical conversations with those leaders to get them, you know, to be more like what we expect.
Great. And do you guys want to comment a little bit more on trying to recruit or promote people of color into administrative positions and kind of having people who are leading the district, what impact that has, who's kind of at the top of the structure?
Yeah, I can talk about that a little bit. So that is actually one thing that we have been good at over the years. We have a lot of leaders in our central office. We have, you know, building leadership, and so that has been something that has been very helpful, right? And a lot of those leaders are some of the people that I have assisting with a lot of our recruiting work. So we have a group of assistant principals at the building level. We call them our equity APs, and they focus on a lot of our equity initiatives in the buildings. But one of the things that we also have them doing is assisting with a lot of our recruiting efforts, and they are great with that. You know, some of our central office leaders, our curriculum chairs, are the conference I referred to earlier, our professional development conference. One of our other assistant superintendents is one of the co-leaders of that with me, right? And so it's important to have lots of different people in lots of different places who are leading the work in a variety of different ways.
Thanks. And one of your earlier answers, you had talked a little bit about sort of an arrangement you had with your union. And I was wondering if Jason could maybe jump in and talk to us a little bit about how these issues and the unions, where you might see some overlap or issues come up.
Absolutely, thank you. And glad to be here on the panel with such esteemed guests here. So I will first say that was an excellent comment and an excellent way to handle some of these issues. As you know, a lot of times when you decide to deviate from your traditional hiring or retention practices, or something that may not be explicitly stated in a collective bargaining agreement, it's worth considering whether you need to consult the union. And in this case, which you know is always the best solution when the parties can just agree to work through something, that's great. But other times that might not be an option, and you may need to move forward with implementing something. And as you know, in a collective bargaining agreement, it's not always clear what you know is within the discretion of the district or what's something that needs to be bargained. So as you implement these strategies, it's always important to consider whether a bargaining obligation has been triggered, and to work with your counsel to do so. But you know the way it played out in Ken's example is perfect.
Thanks, Jason. A great example and a great reminder to be keyed in on those potential procedures and necessary steps and help rely on legal counsel when necessary. So thinking even more about hiring, Toya and Ken, do you have any recommendations for how hiring committees should be structured? You both touched on that, and maybe even thinking a little bit more deeply into, how they should be structured, how they should approach interviewing and assessment of candidates, and any examples that you found to be successful with those approaches.
Yeah, I can give you one. So this it's really important, right? So we have very tight protocols with our interview process. We are tracking composition of interview teams in HR to ensure that they reflect the racial and gender diversity, and also diversity of perspectives. Since most of our hiring happens at the building level, it's really important to provide some training and ongoing coaching for hiring administrators. Not just the standard things like, these are the things you ask and don't ask in an interview. I'm talking about stuff of substance when you are trying to really ensure you're getting quality educators who are going to work with your students. So for example, we did a workshop for our administrators on focusing your interview questions on things you can't teach, right? So if we have a candidate, for example, who doesn't know much about our specific reading curriculum, but they can demonstrate an ability to build relationships with students and families, and that they're kind, caring human beings who can reach some of our marginalized students, I will take that over knowledge of the reading curriculum every day. They can learn the reading curriculum, but that other stuff is much harder to teach. And so that's often a way to focus your efforts.
Thank you. That's very important and great examples. Toya, do you want to add to that?
Yes, exactly, Ken. I completely agree with you. It's so important to make sure that your hiring committees are composed of people who bring multiple perspectives. Think about it. If everyone on the hiring committee is the same, then you're only hiring more of the same, and you're not getting to the diversity that you're actually looking for. In our building, we have 2 rounds of interviews. Our first round begins with a demo lesson. The candidate prepares that demo lesson and they teach it to our students. We often joke about we hope that they don't get the 9th period student, the 9th period, because kids have been in school all day, and teaching 9th period is a little harder than teaching 1st or 2nd. But they do teach their demo lessons, and it's typically to a hiring committee of 5 to 7 people. Typically, our 3 candidates are passed to our final round. And our final round happens with our assistant superintendent principal, our assistant superintendent for curriculum instruction, our associate principal for literacy and instruction, and the content area of the department chair, where the specific equity questions are asked. So we have a total different set of questions that we ask in the second round. If you do not present an awareness of how to respond to the question in the second round, you probably won't get the job. You could have had a great demo lesson, but we're not looking for people who just know how to teach. We're looking for people who can connect, people who understand what it is that they're supposed to be doing and can then further that down the line. So it's at this point where you cannot waver from your core beliefs if you're truly committed to the process. So Ken, I agree with you 100%. You have to talk to your hiring committee about how to listen for culturally different answers and how to read between the lines when reviewing applications and resumes. Applications and resumes say a lot of things, and you have to learn how to read them. It's not just reading them, you're really reading them. And you'll get extra information out of it when you actually figure that out. The answers that you hear may not be the standard pat answers that you're used to hearing, but when you really want diversity and different approaches to solving teaching the whole student, there's nothing more exciting than figuring out getting a candidate who can do that. So that's what we do.
Awesome. And we've got a follow-up question for you. What are you looking for in that demo lesson related to how the candidate relates to students? Are there particular things that you guys are seeking out?
We look for relations are critical in our building, because we have such a broad range of students. And so we first look for connection. Can you engage the students? Were there students in the back of the class that had their heads down? Were there kids on their phones and weren't listening to what you were saying? So can you relate? Can you hold their interest? And did you do something different that's going to add to the arsenal of teaching that we already have? We have superb teachers in our building. And the training that we get and the professional development that they get is awesome. And so we're really looking for, can you, and I hesitate to use the word fit, okay? I think that's a very dangerous and slippery slope to go down. But the question is, can you be an asset in our building and work and come into the fabric of the rest of the teachers that we have and be able to embrace the culture that we have? That's what they're looking for in a demo lesson, because you can be taught how to be a better teacher. There are certain things, like Ken said, you cannot be taught. And I can tell you, at our second level, we have awesome people who can assess that.
That's awesome. Thank you. Jason, I want to pull you in a little bit more on some of these issues related to recruiting and hiring and some of the legal issues that we see come up. Can you help set listeners at ease with respect to sort of what's okay and what's not okay, and kind of where do they need to be careful?
Sure. So, of course, you ask a lawyer a question, you're not going to get a direct answer. So with that, let me give a little bit of context first. So, first of all, both Congress, the Supreme Court, state, local governments all agree that there is value in voluntary efforts to diversify a workforce. It furthers the objectives of our anti-discrimination statutes that are on the book on all levels. However, there's some limitations. So, those very same state and federal anti-discrimination statutes prohibit discrimination based on a status within a protected class. So there's sort of a balancing act to be had here. And this particularly does apply to your hiring and your retention practices. And in fact, if the language of Title VII, it explicitly prohibits employers from granting preferential treatment, even if it's your goal to sort of remedy past imbalances in your workforce. So the way I'd like to think about this, and hopefully you hear my voice pop in your head every time this happens, or you're considering your policies, to think of it on a spectrum. And the more your practice can potentially result in you making a preferential treatment because of a protected status, the more scrutiny that practice would face. But let's use some of the examples we've heard so far and where they could land on the spectrum here. So, there's been discussion about things like community relationship building, retention efforts, making employees of color feeling welcomed, and efforts to have them stay. These types of efforts are less likely to be subject to legal challenge. They tend to seek to build and expand your applicant pool. It's not the district making a selection based on preferential treatment as it is reaching out to create more opportunities. And that type of activity is fine, so long as they are not adversely affecting another segment of your population. So that's the easier side of the spectrum. The other side of the spectrum, which is clearly will run afoul of the anti-discrimination statutes, is when districts or employers in general, regardless of the sector, set quotas, or you have some policy that says we will hire X amount of a certain type of person into this role by this date. Time and time again, those types of policies have been found to be in violation of anti-discrimination statutes. The tougher question and the tougher type of issues that you may encounter is somewhere in the middle of that spectrum. So let me give you an example. In the news, you may have heard some discussion about Microsoft and Wells Fargo. This past summer, they announced a plan and I use that carefully, a plan, not a quota, but a plan to double their Black managers and leadership. So that's something that is sort of in the middle. It wasn't necessarily a quota, but it definitely sort of started to move further on the spectrum that we're talking about. And I'll come back to that example. But other examples of sort of kind of gray area issues would be when employers decide to state that they want to interview a certain amount of a particular type of candidate. So when you get into this area, it's very, well, first of all, they can be legal and they can be very effective, especially in building up your applicant pool if they're properly implemented. So, you have to really work with experienced counsel who can guide you through how to implement this. And as you'll see, that the key is to have a very detailed plan. And that's something that I've heard so far in the presentation is we know the makeup of our community. There's a reason behind, our goals. There's numbers that we track to keep these, our position within focus. And employers will get in trouble when they don't have that, and they kind of just throw numbers out without really analyzing why. So one way that sometimes employers will address this issue is that they will come up with voluntary affirmative action plans. Now, as you know, affirmative action plans are not required by every employer. There's some by virtue of their relationships with the federal government where they might have to implement an affirmative action plan, but these are very detailed recruitment and hiring promotion plans that really lay out how they're going about this, why they're going about it, and the statistics to support and justify what they're doing. And they're very detailed plans. That's an option if an employer wants to kind of set some type of goal. It's not something you have to do, but it's a way where you can point to something that's required by law and by some to ensure that you're compliant. Again, a lot of employers have dedicated staff and counsel who will put together these plans, so it's not something to enter into lightly. So regardless if you're not even interested in using that type of plan, there are some other best practices to consider. Number one is to seek counsel to be sure that you're implementing these types of plans properly. Number two, and I kind of got into it, is ensuring that any goal that you're setting is tied to actually addressing the representation issues in your particular organization. And you can even be more specific, into the particular position that you're having an issue with. Again, you analyze the statistics in your workplace as compared to the local workforce. And you have to be sure that it doesn't unduly harm the non-targeted groups. And lastly, this should be something that's not permanent. It should be reviewed, and the idea is that the more that it is effective, the less that you would actually have to have a plan in that place. So going back to our earlier example with Microsoft and Wells Fargo, there was an investigation open into those that they made those statements publicly, and there was an investigation by the Department of Labor, and that investigation was closed after both parties provided very detailed descriptions and data and statistics of why the plan was needed and how they were going to go about it, how long it would last. So, based on that, the department dropped their inquiry into that announcement. The last thing I will say, we're monitoring this, but there's proposed legislation in Illinois that would amend the school code and require districts with a minimum population of 3,000 or more students to interview a minimum percentage of minority candidates for teaching positions. And then it further provides that if the school district is unable to interview the requisite amount or of that percentage for 2 consecutive years, the district would have to implement a program for school district employees interested in obtaining a professional educator license. So again, this is just something that has been proposed. We'll continue to monitor it. And of course, you can all expect to hear from us if this bill passes in this form or some form.
Thanks, Jason. There's a lot here. It obviously is a fairly complex legal issue. I saw a question from one of our colleagues in the Q&A asking Toya and Ken if you guys have set any of these type goals, or if there are numbers in your plans, and kind of how you got to those numbers and how you made sure that you were staying on the right side of the law with those types of plans.
We don't have a formal plan like that. You know, again, it's not something that we have a hard time focusing on. And so we typically take a look at our numbers for where our students population looks like, where we are with our faculty and staff, and you know, the year before, and we make sure that those numbers are in line. We don't have a formal plan that way because we haven't had to develop that.
Yeah, we don't have formal numbers either. You know, one of our aspirations is always we want staff that mirror the diversity of the students we serve, right? We're not there. We are better than a lot of school districts, but I'm never happy with better than a lot of school districts, right? So that's always been a focus for us and always improving. I will touch on what Jason said. We do have voluntarily already a program for some of our employees to gain professional educator licensure. That's actually another thing we worked with our support staff union on and our teachers union, because those people are guaranteed a job if they complete the program. One of the things we are going to be looking at here in the coming year, COVID's kind of put a lot of things on hold, unfortunately, is expanding that, right? And that goes to some of the work we've tried to do with a variety of colleges in terms of licensure and ensuring that people who enter these programs can actually get licensure. That's a whole other webinar, and I could talk for hours on the challenges with some of that. And so that we call it our Grow Your Own program, and it is not as robust as we want it to be, and it's something we are going to be beefing up. There are logistical challenges, unfortunately, with a lot of the college and university credentialing and things that make some of that more challenging than I'd like, honestly. But that's going to be a continued area of focus here moving forward.
Thanks. And Jason, we've got another question in the chat to explain what you mean by non-targeted groups not being unduly affected by these types of efforts. Can you explain what that means?
Sure. And I'll be as frank as possible here. So if you are implementing programs that are seeking to increase your diverse or let's say your persons of color staff, you have to be careful so that it does not adversely affect the non persons of color. That's as simple as I can make it.
Sure.
You know, your targeted population can't affect you know, anyone else outside of that targeted group. And I wanted to make one quick comment. Toya, there have been wonderful comments, but Toya may have made the comment of the session here when she talked about the use of the word fit, and I know that you are evaluating potential candidates on cultural, their ability to address and work within a certain culture, but she really hit it on when she said that, you know, you don't want to call that, you know, you are not a good fit. That is never a good phrase to be used in any employment context because it's very ambiguous. It can be spun a million different ways, even if your intentions are good. So I just wanted to point out the importance of that comment.
Thank you so much, Jason. Such critical points. Why don't we go ahead and bring Jennifer Kirmes in here into the discussion. We've been talking a lot about strategies and the importance of having a supportive and inclusive school environment for all staff and students. So Jennifer, can you talk a bit about how those goals relate to Illinois' new culturally responsive teaching and leading standards? Perhaps providing some background on how ISBE developed and enacted the standards, the process that took to develop them, and how, you know, ISBE was plans to oversee the implementation of the standards. I know we've been hearing a lot about them.
Absolutely, thank you. I have really enjoyed listening to the conversation thus far, and I think that these standards do align very closely to what both Toya and Ken have said about the importance of the environment and the role that the environment plays, you know, in terms of recruitment, but especially in terms of retention, and ultimately, obviously, the reason we're all here in terms of student outcomes. So we see the standards work as very closely tied into all of these topics. So we started this work on the culturally responsive teaching and leading standards back in 2018. We joined on to the Council of Chief State School Officers Diverse and Learner Ready Teacher Initiative. There were about 8 or 9 states that were part of that, and Illinois was happy to be one of those states. As part of that work, we first formed a steering committee, and it was this steering committee that identified that the development of culturally responsive teaching and leading standards, or standards that address cultural responsiveness for educators, could be of benefit to our educational landscape here in Illinois and to educator preparation in particular. And I think this is very connected to both Toya's comments about what they look for in terms of relationship building during the demo lesson, and Ken's comments about what you can teach and can't teach. And so I certainly agree that we do not want to be teaching educators how to value multiple perspectives and build relationships with students and communities while they're already teaching. And so we want that to happen earlier. We want that to happen as part of preparation to give them even more candidates who can demonstrate those skills, because it's an expectation. And so to develop the standards, we pulled together a larger group of educators, and we called them the Diverse and Learner Ready Teacher Network. We used a rubric-based application process to select the individuals who would then draft the standards. And then, because they are standards for our educator preparation programs, we took them through the rulemaking process. And so that means we released them for public comment. We took that public comment, made some adjustments, sent them back to JCAR. And ultimately now the next step is to work closely, with our colleges and universities who prepare our teachers and future school leaders on the implementation. And, we don't think this is something that can be rushed. We think it's something that needs to really be deeply contemplated, understood, a lot of conversations, a lot of sharing of practices. There are a number of schools and programs where this is already happening at a high level. And so really building off of that and just ensuring that this becomes the norm instead of, a spotlight.
And you touched on this a little bit already. We saw the state superintendent acknowledge in a statement recently that research shows that teachers of color help close achievement gaps for students of color and are highly rated by students of all races. And she also stated that incorporating these new standards into education preparation programs will help to attract and retain educators of color. So can you share more about how, in particular, the standards are intended to support this work of districts to attract and retain diverse teachers and administrators?
Definitely. So in terms of attracting and retaining diverse educators of color in particular, we think that these standards are an important statement. But they're more than that. They're a stake in the ground that says, here in Illinois, backgrounds, experiences, viewpoints that all people bring to the classroom are valued. And that goes for both the adults and for the children. And so what these standards do is provide a framework for instructional planning and delivery that's rooted in what is best for the students being served, which we think will have the benefit of opening up some pedagogical avenues that will help all students, but particularly students of color succeed. I think that this is an articulation of one aspect of that supportive environment that we've been talking about since the beginning of our time together today that's so important. I think all educators want to work in spaces where the best outcomes for students are what is driving things. And I think that these standards help us to ask the right questions and consider the right diverse perspectives and viewpoints and embed really the needs of every local community and the decisions that are made.
Thanks. And I think, we've got a really friendly audience here, but I know you have heard a lot of pushback, and ISBE has gotten a lot of pushback on this. And some of the administrators listening, to the extent they're trying to incorporate these ideas and these standards into their own professional development for their current teachers and their current practices, kind of what type of response do you have to critics, who charge that this is ideological, or it's taking away from, our focus on teaching reading and math and making sure teachers are prepared for that?
Sure. So it has always been our position, and we still firmly believe that these standards and educators who are more proficient in culturally responsive practices will help schools be more and not less inclusive of diverse viewpoints. And so that includes our strongest supporters and our most ardent critics. And so the standards don't promote any one way of thinking or believing. What they do is invite all educators to self-reflect on how their own backgrounds and personal convictions can influence their teaching practice in ways that are promotive of student achievement, and maybe in some ways that need some adjustment in order to be more promotive of student achievement. So we think that by supporting more effective teaching, culturally responsive practices are a value add for everyone, and they will support greater academic learning for all students. It's not an either or. It's not that you are being culturally responsive or you are teaching academics. It is that culturally responsive pedagogy and practices and environments promote student achievement. So cultural responsiveness is the how, and the academics and the skills and the competencies that we aim to develop in our young people are absolutely still the what. We think this will just help us do it better.
Thank you so much. Ken and Toya, let's bring you back into the discussion to hear a little bit more. You've talked a lot about your strategies that you've put in place that we've been talking about all in our time today. Can you talk a bit more about what systems you and your districts have in place to measure your progress with these initiatives?
Yeah, so we prepare a very detailed annual report for our Board of Education, and we've been doing it for decades, on the diversity of our staff, broken out in all sorts of different ways, educators, administrators, support staff, different groups within those groups. It's hundreds of pages. It's available on our website. We're actually working on the one from last year for an upcoming board meeting. And as part of that, our principals and our hiring administrators provide written reports in some years on some of their efforts. We also, as part of our annual staffing process, right, we have discussions where our building leaders are talking with me and their supervisor about their work in some of the areas we've talked about. And I think that, we have some administrators who are very thoughtful about how they track it. We have some administrators who are very thoughtful about the efforts they're undertaking, and we're always asking them, what are their goals in that area? Because again, it's not just an HR function, right? Particularly when it comes to the retention, right? Toya's hit that on several occasions. She's absolutely right. Some of the conversations, honestly, are very frank and candid when we have administrators who we don't see as a fit for some of the work that we're trying to achieve at the district level. We can and we should at the central office be working with our building and department leaders to help them be better, right? There are only so many things we can do, and so continually monitoring and having those ongoing conversations, some very non-threatening, but sometimes, quite honestly, more frank about the values we hold as a district, need to happen. And I think that's a very key function and an important thing.
I would say that I agree with you, Ken, that it's difficult to have those conversations, but required because, people are born and raised different ways by different people, and have different values and beliefs. We are not in the business of trying to raise them or change those necessarily. What we do make sure that everyone understands is that these are our values in the building. And if you're going to be successful working here, this is what we're looking for. When people find that they cannot rise to that occasion, we help them understand that perhaps this isn't the best place for them to be. So, because we need to keep moving forward with the initiatives that we have. We too prepare reports so that everybody knows what the data is. Every year during our hiring season, we assess the numbers. I think I said this before, both our staff and our students, to make sure that our numbers are in line and whether we need to adjust our hiring to reflect our student population. We do that. We think that's a huge measure of success, because we do that because we know that the staffing that reflects student population helps achievement. And so every year, I've been in ETHS for 18 years. I've been in HR for 30. And so, in all the different places, we want to make sure that what we're doing is actually working and actually addressing the goals that we set. It's nothing big and fancy in our district. We can see it. I know it. We track the numbers. We have conversations about it, and we can see it. And when it doesn't do what we think it needs to do for the achievement of students, we talk about it and we do better next time. So it's not a big fancy thing. And I have, like I said, I've been doing this for 30 years, and I never have subscribed to the big fancy, models and pie charts and all those things, because it's a lot of work for something you can just see. You know what you're doing, and if your hiring is better or worse than last year. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure that out. So I choose to spend my time on doing the action as opposed to all the pretty reports.
Yeah, so it's sort of some different ways to get there, but measuring where you are, I think if you haven't taken a look at what that is, it's hard to make adjustments and to know if what you're doing is successful if you aren't taking a moment to take stock of where you are on those things. So that's helpful to hear both of those perspectives. And I kind of want to more broadly kind of bring us back for thoughts for our listeners about how do you approach these goals? I think you come to this very passionately, and that obviously drives what you're doing. But can you talk a little bit more about how you stay focused on improving and making some progress forward?
So, I said earlier, we've been doing this work for a while. I think it's really important to remember that it's okay not to be perfect in this work. It's hard work. But it's never okay to just give up because it feels daunting. It's hard. And, there are days when you say, is it really worth it? Yeah, it's worth it. I think things and events in today's society have created an urgency to be better at including people of color. My viewpoint is, yes, it's urgent. It has been urgent all of my life. Okay. It is something urgent. It is something that's being brought to the forefront. But my caution to this sense of urgency is to take things step by step and celebrate the small successes. Start with small, realistic goals and increase them over time. It's more important to gain traction and be successful than to just pay lip service to it. You will be frustrated if you take on large goals and cannot reach them. So just be genuine and remember that you are not just recruiting. You are also striving to develop, include, celebrate, and retain. And while you build that relational trust that is required, you're going to have a much more cohesive and robust team. So I would say pump your brakes a little bit, not compare yourself to the Joneses, figure out what you have to do in your own environment, and then develop your own process.
Yeah, I will echo a lot of that, right? We are always looking, how can we be better? How can we do things a little bit differently that's going to meet the needs, right? And sometimes it's just minor changes. It's not necessarily huge overarching changes. I've said before, there are a lot of people throughout the state and throughout the country who value this work, right? So it's very competitive with a lot of these sorts of things. And so you have to stay in front of it to make sure that you are doing the very best work you can for your district and your kids. Things move so rapidly out there in the recruiting world, you have to change rapidly with it. It's also really important that you're listening to a variety of stakeholders, especially your educators of color, your staff members of color, so you can be as effective as possible, right? I'm a white guy, right? Some of the best ideas I get, right, are from a lens that is not of a white guy. And so being okay with that is super important. I also, I wouldn't underestimate the value of your support staff. Some of our support staff build fantastic relationships with our kids. They are everything we want for our students. They have great ideas, whether it's for their own growth and, hey, I want to be an educator and we can support that through various things, or here's how you can support your educators better, even though I myself don't want to be an educator, right? So listening to those voices, don't ever shut people out because of what role they have in your district. Some of the best ideas I've gotten in some of my work have been from staff, our support staff that have said, nobody else has listened to me, right? And I think that is so important to always be open to the experiences and the values and the thoughts others have. Toya said it earlier, right? Students have given great ideas. We actually include on our principal hiring teams students. And we have them give tours of our buildings. And at the end, we say to students, okay, thumbs up, thumbs sideways, or thumbs down on those candidates. Some of the best insight we get is from that thumbs up, thumbs sideways, or thumbs down. And so, always, and because they're looking for those human things that, right, they don't know what the reading curriculum nuances are, right, but they know who's making an effort to engage me as a kind human being. And I guess the last thing I'd offer, right, is that I can't stress enough, hiring, recruiting, retaining, that is somewhat of an HR function, but it is not just an HR function. It is the leaders in the buildings and the colleagues and that lateral accountability. Those are the people who are doing the bulk of the efforts. I can get people in the door, but I can't necessarily make them stay, right? Because I don't have that level of influence over them every day. And so leadership really matters.
Such an important point to close on. So thank you both for those. And I did want to also mention, Jennifer spoke obviously a lot about the standards, and we did recently share a summary of the culturally responsive teaching and leading standards in an alert on our website. So you can find that there to find even more specific resources. We also link then to the actual standards as well. And I know we'll be likely seeing more to come from ISBE on how those will be rolling out and getting higher education preparatory programs prepared for those.
Awesome. Thank you to everybody for our wonderful guest, and to Jason. I feel like I've learned a lot today. This has been really, really exciting. And thank you to all of our listeners for joining us. So we're grateful to everybody for sharing their insights and for asking questions. If listeners do have additional questions or want to talk about these issues, our guests have generously volunteered that you can reach out to them directly, and they're happy to talk with you. If you have legal questions, obviously contact one of our attorneys here at Franzik. And we know this work is really a process. It's an ongoing conversation. So please do reach out if you have additional questions or topics that you think we should cover as part of the series. We'd love to hear from you if you think your district is doing a really good job on some of these topics and you want us to highlight that. So if you want to share this with your colleagues, the recording will be available on our Franzik website. It's also will be posted on our Education Law Insights podcast. So if you're a podcast person, that is available too. Please do join us again on April 8th for our next equity webinar, and we're going to be focusing on curriculum. So thank you for being part of this effort and for all the work that you're doing to educate students.